Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. Today, we're going to get into social platforms and how they went from being a place for friends to being a threat to democracy. Good morning, Dee. Are any of your Facebook groups or social circles being used to radicalize people today?
No, not today. I've actually been invited to some of those kinds of groups. Something like, oh, hey, check this out. And then I take a look at it and it's like, wow, that's a whole lot of anti-vaxxer or QAnon stuff. And I'm like, all right.
Really? People have invited you to those?
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of people who are just like, oh my God, you need to get educated on this stuff. And I'm like, okay. But yeah, it's out there. There's definitely a lot of information out there that is kind of being used to radicalize people, being used to kind of get them into these groups, and it's still happening. And thankfully, I think that the social groups are actually being a little bit better about it and shutting some of these things down. But man, it took a lot in order to get them there.
You know, it's gone on for a really long time. It's not just these social networks that currently exist right now. I remember being on BBS systems back in I think it was like the early 90s when I first started dialing into BBSs with my like 600 baud modem or something like that. And you'd be on there playing games with people and chatting and stuff like that. And every once in a while, someone would come in and say absolutely horrible things about you and your mother.
Yeah.
So, it's just kind of been around forever. It's, IRC, same thing, right? But this is a really interesting topic because, obviously it's big in the news right now, and it just didn't start that way, right? I mean, this was not its initial intention, is to end up being this like horrible place where people go to like say horrible things about other people and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that was anybody's vision, right? It's just kind of like there was just a bunch of different influences and factors that ended up bringing us here. But let me start off by going over real quick kind of the history of social, and then we can get into like how it went from that to where we are now. Okay. So like you mentioned, the early social stuff that really showed up were BBS systems in the 70s. And there were some precursors to that, but they were essentially what BBS systems were. I'm sure you remember BBS systems because they were around until the 90s. And if you were, like us growing up in Silicon Valley, you probably remember those old modems that you actually take your phone off and put your phone onto the modem. Like in, what was that movie? Was it Sneakers where they had that?
Yeah, they do it in Sneakers, and then also Halt and Catch Fire, the AMC miniseries that was on recently.
Yeah. So even back then, the BBS systems could get a little dodgy. Once you got into the 90s, though, then you started having kind of the web protocols taking over. So before, a lot of the BBS stuff was kind of peer-to-peer. But once you got into the 90s, now you could have something that was hosted on a server. And then the BBS systems got replaced by forums and IRC and chat rooms. And it still had a lot of the same problems, right? Where, you had the flame wars and things like that going on. But it wasn't necessarily something that was organized like it is now. And then the first real platforms started showing up in the early 2000s, and some of them went even a little bit earlier than that. But the ones that kind of established the model were Friendster and LinkedIn. They were the first ones to do it. And then MySpace came along and kind of took Friendster's fire and ran with it. And it really established kind of the model of what we think of now as social, connecting people and allowing them to chat and communicate with each other. Then over time, Twitter and Facebook came along and they gobbled up the market share. And since then, they've largely been just acquiring their competition so that nobody could really challenge them. So they acquired Instagram and Vine and WhatsApp and Periscope and a bunch of others. And then nowadays you have some companies like Snap and TikTok and Telegram who've managed to stay independent. And we're still kind of waiting to see what's going to happen with that, right? Snap went public and then their stock looked like it wasn't going to be that great for a while. And it started to pick up. But at the same time, I don't know anybody who's really on Snapchat on any significant amount of time. TikTok is kind of stolen their thunder also. Do you use any of those platforms, Brian? You notice anything kind of change over the time?
Yeah, so I don't use Facebook anymore. I think I canceled it about 2 years ago. I wasn't super active on it, but every once in a while, like people I haven't talked to in a long time would reach out to me on there. So I left it up and running. And then eventually I just got rid of it because I just really didn't like what was happening from the Facebook front. And then I'm still on Instagram because every once in a while I'll do maker projects, things like that, and I'll kind of share them on there. And it's kind of a fun community. of people there. And I also like to follow surfers because they're always showing like really cool surf videos and stuff. So it's been kind of a fun engagement on Instagram. I have WhatsApp, and I use WhatsApp to communicate with all my neighbors. It's kind of a funny thing, but we're all on there, and that's how we chat with each other about what's going on in the neighborhood. I don't really play around with Snap or TikTok or Telegram or anything like that. I have friends that do, and they'll show me things on it, but I haven't really fully engaged into it. What I've noticed over time was that when it first started, it was like this way of connecting with people that you haven't seen in a long time, or you
Mhm.
just wouldn't even know how to get a hold of them,
Yeah.
right? And then it transformed into, oh, okay, here's this news feed, and suddenly you have to basically take all your friends' stream of consciousness and consume it on a daily basis. And people started putting up not just cool and funny stuff and family related stuff. It started turning into, well, I believe this and I believe that, and it got nastier and nastier, and it just wasn't interesting anymore, in my
Yeah.
opinion. It's just not fun, right? And the thing about Instagram that's really kept it, I think, doing well is it's mostly about pictures. It's mostly about video. I rarely see anyone put anything horrible on there. I guess I don't read that deep into the comment sections anyways, but I see pretty much only great stuff on there. And the people that I follow are just people who are producing content that I find to be interesting. So it's still alive for me. If it gets kind of nasty, it'll be out the door because I just don't have time for that.
Yeah, I feel like Twitter kind of established that newsfeed concept, and then a variety of companies like Facebook copied it. But one of the things I think one of the ways that Instagram's been able to avoid that is that you can't paste a link into a normal post. You can only do it in your profile, but you can't just be sharing links all the time.
And I think the underlying technology behind some of these platforms is pretty cool. I mean, if you look at Twitter and you actually step back and you say, okay, take away all the garbage that's on there, and you look at just the people that you're following, and let's say it's credible news sources, things like that, you can get information in real time. Like it's really
Mhm.
cool in that sense. Like for example, being in the Bay Area, you can follow some of the Twitter feeds for BART or for Caltrain, and it'll tell you, oh, there was an accident, Caltrain's delayed, don't take Caltrain. And it'll tell you within like 10 seconds of something happening. It's like
Mhm.
shockingly fast and useful. But on the other side, there's just like a lot of crap, so to speak, that
Yeah.
flows through there that really kind of enrages you or makes you feel sad or upset. And it's like, why do you want to dedicate your time to that? That's just my feeling.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. Well, let me ask you before we move on and get into kind of like where the change happened. Do you use Nextdoor a great deal?
Use is an interesting word. So I log into Nextdoor because it informs me about things that are happening on my street and in my local area. I exclusively, I would say, use Nextdoor to sell stuff. So like
Oh,
if we have a
okay.
chair or a couch or anything that we're just not interested in anymore and want to buy something new, I put it up on Nextdoor. It's gone within a week. It's been a
Yeah.
pretty amazing platform. It's replaced Craigslist for me in that sense. But it's starting to get a little nasty on there, though. The other day, I went on and started looking at some of the posts because I normally don't read the posts, but I don't know, I heard a huge boom outside, and I was like, oh, I wonder what that was. And man, the fighting
Oh,
about
yeah.
random things
It's
like someone picked
crazy.
an orange from my tree, and suddenly 68 people commented on it.
Yeah, it gets nuts, and I think it's a little bit dangerous because these are people who are close enough to actually know who the other people are, and it can lead into other problems. It's to some extent is the bane of my existence because I made the mistake of allowing them to send me notifications of things that are going on Nextdoor. So I'll get things like, oh, hey, this suspicious looking guy was walking down the street, or like, oh, hey, we have too many squirrels. And I'm just like, oh my God, the busybody nature of things. And then you're letting these busybodies communicate with each other so they can come into conflict with each other. And it just turns into like crazy flame wars and then neighbors not getting along. And I'm like, oh my God, like, there's a reason why they call them good neighbor fences.
Yep, I agree with that. And actually, one of the things that happens pretty regularly, I guess, on Nextdoor, I've seen it happen maybe like 2 or 3 times in our area. People will just like take a picture of someone who's walking down the street
Yeah.
and then be like, "I saw this person walking down the street. Do you guys know is this a good person or a bad person?" And you're like, what? That's weird.
It's
Why are
very
you
it's
just
very
taking?
get a life, man. People have a right to walk down the street.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of that weird stuff happening. But overall, though, like I would say with the sales stuff has been great. Like I can't believe how easy it is to sell something on there.
Well, that's an interesting use case. I might have to dive into that just because I have some things to sell, and now that we're getting vaccinated and stuff, it might be time to actually sell them. With that said, I kind of want to get into. There are some very interesting things that people might not be aware of that actually caused or enabled this transition to happen, this transformation. Up until relatively easy recently, probably around 2010s, the social was mostly about being social, being connected with friends and family members, sharing experiences. And it was a little bit more interpersonal. It wasn't really ideological, right? It was just what we think, what we remember. And we still have some flame wars and things crop up every now and then, but it wasn't things that got out of hand. And one of the major events that kind of spearheaded a change in what social was actually the around 2011. There was this international protest movement, and there were some actual political revolts that happened around it. It was mostly in the Middle East, North Africa, just the Muslim countries. It was called Arab Spring. And what this was were mostly younger people. They were protesting or sometimes violently revolting against repressive regimes, and actually led to regime change in countries like Libya, with Gaddafi being pushed out, and Egypt and Mubarak being pushed out. And it was all enabled by social media. And people were using social platforms like Facebook in order to organize their protests or their other activities, and they were also using platforms like Facebook and Twitter to get news out, to get messages out, and videos of like, here's how the government was responding to us. And it managed to bypass state-run media channels and get stories out that would have not have normally gotten out. Like if you looked at the Tiananmen Square protests and how the Chinese government responded to that,
Uh huh.
and that very famous Tank Man photo. I read up a story on how that photo came to light, and it took months for that photographer to smuggle the film out of the country and then get it publicized. So nowadays, with social media, that all went out immediately. And I'm sure you remember all of this stuff happening when it was. But we all looked at this and we thought, oh, this is a good thing. This is great. This is providing, this is a democratizing element where it's providing people with a voice who might not have had a voice previously. So there was ultimately, though, it kind of had a dark side to the outcome. It gave people ideas for how they could use social media. And by 2015, we saw some extremists and terrorist groups such as ISIS using social media platforms like Facebook to recruit and radicalize people into their ideology. And some of them, especially like ISIS and some of those groups, they got shut down. Their recruitment groups kind of largely got shut down by around 2016, 2017. But some of the other ones, some white nationalist groups, and those ones continue to stick around. And who can say why per se? But I think part of it was it was a little bit less clear where it was going to lead. But you saw some, white nationalist groups showing up on Facebook and Reddit and Fortran, and they were recruiting people by, espousing their ideologies. And then they were also organizing certain events. And this led to, along with the founding of sites like the Daily Stormer and Gab and Parler, who specifically tailored to those groups. And most people don't remember that Daily Stormer, it wasn't just like a news site. The community forums there were a big part of what it was. People were using these social media sites to organize events that ended up turning deadly. And not to paint with a broad brush, but not everybody who was there was violent. But everybody there was adhered to a certain ideology, and that ideology ended up being associated with violence. So that was like the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where someone lost their life. They had the Capitol attack earlier this year, with people storming the Capitol building, where multiple people lost their lives. Even right near us, just a few miles from here, on the Gilroy Garlic Festival, they had a mass shooting a few years ago where it turned out that the shooter was entrenched in online white supremacy forums and things about removing immigrants and people of color from society. So a lot of this has been enabled by social media.
So let me ask you a question about this, because I know you did a tremendous amount of research in this area before we did this podcast. So when you say that the sites like the Daily Stormer and Gab and Parler were kind of geared towards getting people like this on their platform, what does that mean? Does that mean that the technology itself was designed for that? Or like, why did they head toward those particular sites rather than continuing to push on, let's say, Facebook and Twitter and some of the other more mainstream platforms?
So as much as we go after Facebook and Twitter for not doing enough to moderate discourse on their platforms, these other platforms like Gab and Parler, they explicitly were avoiding doing so. So it was a place where these people had free reign in order to say what they wanted to say, and to actually organize events. Daily Stormer, they were basically marketing towards white nationalists, white supremacists, people. It's an actual reference to Nazi Germany. And quite a few of them were like, hey, look, this is a place for quote unquote right leaning people, which I would argue is they kind of label themselves as right and conservative, but there's not a lot conservative about them relative to what we would think about as a political conservative like 40 years ago. And I think you remember both the Gilroy Garlic Festival and there was a shooting in El Paso that killed quite a few people. Mm-hmm. And there were like manifestos that came out afterwards about the person's political stance and how it involved like removing immigrants, removing people of color, and creating or keeping the country kind of a white supremacist society.
It's just that when you have a platform and you give people the opportunity to do something like that, they'll find the place where they're accepted, right? So prior to all of these platforms existing, where did they go then?
Well, I think that they mostly stayed within their kind of immediate social circle, or maybe they kept quiet about it. I mean, there were organizations like the KKK or basically Nazi organizations that previously existed, and they would probably get together at, whatever local meeting spot they could have and kind of share their ideologies. This was an opportunity for people to get online, and just like it social multiplied the communication and organization capability of people fighting for freedom in Arab Spring, it also multiplied those same capabilities for people who kind of wanted to try to dictate where society was going to go.
Also seen, right, in foreign nations as well, right? This is the whole idea about what Russia was trying to do, right?
Yeah, so that's kind of one of the last pieces of the puzzle from an external standpoint. And then next we'll talk about what was going on the side of the social platforms. But foreign nations, not just Russia, but most notably Russia, saw an opportunity. So Russia, for example, and this is documented, launched a large multinational program to maximize division and chaos, and not just in the US, but a variety of countries. We saw this show up in France and the UK and Germany and other places around the world. But all they're sought to do was to say and amplify whatever was divisive. It was trying to get people to be very angry with each other and fighting with each other. So along with this, we saw some people who were not associated with these programs at all. These are just opportunists on both the left and the right who noticed that, oh, hey, these people who are going out there and saying very inflammatory things, they are being able to get a lot of attention. Some of them are getting media deals. Some of them are making money off of this and becoming, minor celebrities. So they're jumping on board, and they are just putting out intentionally contentious and inflammatory stuff on platforms like Twitter and Facebook, just because they know that this is a pathway for them to become famous, to become like a media personality.
Basically, over the course of almost a decade, got turned around into a weapon.
Yes, and there are some people who just out of opportunity's sake went right along with it, even though they weren't necessarily associated with any of these extremist groups. And I've seen it happen with people on both the left and the right who are they're just posting things because they know that it's going to get a lot of attention, that not because they're trying to say, be informative or be constructive or to change anybody's mind per se. They're just putting something out there because they know that whoever disagrees with them is going to do so loudly.
Yeah.
And they're going to comment. They're going to call them names. They're going to do anything else that's part of their shtick, right? This is like they're all doing this in order to drum up attention. It's kind of the modern shock jock, basically.
You look at it, and for every 5 horrible articles you read about something that bad that happened, every once in a while something great happens too, right? So like someone posts about, an old friend who's very ill, and next thing you know, all of their medical bills are paid because they were able to drum up all these people on a social network to assist and help out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the challenge of it, right? Is that like it's not all bad, but the bad seems to be outweighing the good right now.
Well, when you have people actually attacking the Capitol or going on mass shootings, it's hard and they're politically motivated, and those people were organized on social media. It's hard to argue that the bad is not outweighing is not outweighing the good, because the bad is really bad. I know the big thing that people might not be aware of if you're outside of Silicon Valley is like, how did this happen? So let's dive into kind of the social media platforms perspective. And honestly, I feel like there was a turning point when you had social platforms and then you had social media platforms. And those capabilities, they added like sharing links or creating groups around ideologies were part of the transition. But one of the things I'll say is that social platforms, they all started with good intentions. They all started with the goal of like, you know what, people are too disconnected. We're going to try to connect them. We're going to try to make it so that you don't really need a high school reunion in order to know what everybody that you went to high school with is doing nowadays.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's that old saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So to provide an example, I'm going to look at Facebook because they are kind of the whipping boy for good reason around this. So platforms like Facebook, when they were designing their experience, they found that content with more comments kept users engaged in the platform. So what they decided within their algorithm is that they emphasize content with more comments. So if you have a post and you have a comments and respond to it versus people who like it, they within their ranking algorithm for presentation are going to emphasize the ones that have more comments. So you can test this out. You can go on to any like local news site, for example, and see what they've posted on Facebook. And if you go into the comments, you'll notice that the comments that have the most replies are going to be shown higher in the comment string than comments that have more likes. And it's been like that for quite some time. And that it was just done so because they were trying to keep people engaged in the platform. It's good for Facebook if people stay on the platform. It's good. They get more information. It makes it more sticky. That's all things that are considered just objectively good for Facebook. Now, where you get into trouble here is when you get into kind of human nature, which is, as it turns out, the easiest way to get a lot of comments or a lot of replies is with something that's extremely inflammatory or contradictory. That's just, if you're thinking about the Force, this is the dark side. This is the fast and easy path. Unintentionally, Facebook's algorithms designed to maximize engagement ended up fostering conflict on the platform by elevating the things that were most easily able to get a lot of engagement. But probably the most important part of all this is to keep in mind that through all this, when you saw conflict kind of blooming on the platform, at the same time, financially, it was good for Facebook because it kept people engaged and on the platform, interacting with more things and seeing more ads. And people got addicted to it. Like everybody started doom scrolling or they started replying to things way too much. There was like this kind of this highly visceral kind of response to it. Like, have you ever experienced something like that where you're like, oh, I can't look away from this train wreck on Facebook or on?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's definitely been times, I haven't been on Facebook in years, but like there are times when someone will send me like either an Instagram post or something like that of something crazy that happened. And next thing I know, I've watched it 4 times, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that's just how it works. Human
Yeah.
nature.
I've definitely, I mean, I'm a researcher at heart, so it's information being correct is important to me. And it's hard sometimes when somebody's putting out this information that is just the data absolutely indicates is incorrect to like not engage because it's not about for that person. It's not necessarily about the information being correct or not. A lot of times it's just like, I'm going to put out something that's intentionally incorrect just so I can get a million people correcting me like a troll, basically, because it's going to increase my views, and then everybody's going to become more aware of me. So there's another thing that was at play here, and that was blitzscaling. So many of the social platforms that came up in the era, they came up in the era of blitzscaling, and what that if you're not familiar with blitzscaling, basically what it is you take a startup usually and you run it at a loss in order to maximize growth, and you're trying to get to a liquidation event as quickly as possible. The reason why you would do blitzscaling is because ultimately it's good for the investors, and to a substantial extent, the founders of a company are investors because they own equity in the company. But the idea is that if you have a win, you can get to that win as quickly as possible so you can make your money and get out and get on to your next win. So that way you keep the machine going. If you have a loss, then you find out if it's a loss more quickly than if you stretch it out over a longer period of time. And that way you can cut your losses more quickly. You can not sink as much time into it, and you can move on to your next win. It's not a bad idea ultimately, but at the same time, it can create weaknesses in a company if they've been growth obsessed for a long time and now they have to change course. So a lot of times this can mean racing the clock. You're trying to get to an IPO or an acquisition before the money runs out. And you've seen some companies do some very strange and unusual things in order to keep the clock running. But in order for this to really for a company that's been blitzscaling for a long time, for them to transition to a more normal long term business strategy after they get their exit or their IPO, they then need to cut spending or increase revenue in order to kind of fix the financial hole they've dug themselves into. But in reality, that's not that easy. And sometimes as soon as you cut spending on something or you increase revenue in another way, that can have a detrimental effect on the growth that you've had. And for example, with Facebook, before they had their IPO, there wasn't a lot of advertising on the platform. And then we see where it is now, and that's driven quite a few users away. And IPO ran into this problem. They had their IPO in 2012, the same year that the Arab Spring movement was happening. They released their IPO at $38 a share and almost immediately dropped, bottoming at around $18 a share. And it stayed underwater for a year. There's an important thing to know within Silicon Valley companies is that the stock price is a huge problem. A low stock price is a huge problem because a lot of their hiring and compensation is based around stock grants. So a company that has a good stock price is going to pay somebody a certain amount in cash, and they're going to make up the rest in stock grants like RSUs. So if that stock's not worth as much money anymore, they have to compensate that by actually paying them cash up front. And that can cut into their bottom line, and it can make it more difficult to attract talent. And in Silicon Valley, attracting talent is a big deal because ultimately there's just not enough engineers and designers and people who are very good at those jobs to go around. So you see bidding wars, and I've seen companies, or very well known companies, who have had like a job rack up for a year or more for a good interaction designer or sometimes a visual designer.
Yeah, and to your point about that is if you go back like Facebook IPOing in 2012 and being down around $18 a share and then starting to work its way up. I mean, as of today, it's $300 a share.
Yeah.
right? And it kind of shows you how people are valuing it because of its advertising model, right? It actually allows you to pinpoint specific people who would be interested in the products that you're trying to sell on the
Mhm.
platform. And when you have more and more people, regardless of what their interests are, the machine keeps moving, right? And it keeps
Yeah.
growing, right? And it's hard to just say, oh, we're just going to shut all this down because of this bad behavior that's happening. It's like they're looking for ways in order to mitigate that behavior and keep the advertising machine up and running.
Yeah. And I think you remember this too, Brian. Back in 2012, we were around, and we remember when the stock hit $18, and there were a bunch of people who had like stock grants where their strike price was above that. They might have like a
Yeah.
a $22 strike price, and they're like, I can't sell this stock because I'm going to lose money.
Yep. Yep. And that happens a lot. And a lot of the wisdom in Silicon Valley is that if you think it's a good, strong company, you essentially just hold it forever, or you
Mhm.
don't really sell it. But that doesn't translate to the personal, because when people have these stock grants and they've worked very hard for, a decade in order to get them, or 4 years or whatever it is, a lot of times they want to cash that out because they're looking to buy a home or start a family or do something, and
Mhm.
they need that revenue. So it becomes a challenge, like you mentioned.
Yeah. And one of the things that happened that I remember very clearly, and you probably do too, is that right when that happened, there was kind of an exodus from Facebook.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly. It feels very fuzzy because it was around the time when we had that financial collapse, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, I think that was kind of on my mind at the time. So I wasn't tracking things as tightly as I do right now. But for sure, right? People will go where they need to people will do what they need to do in order to take care of themselves and their families, right? So
Yeah.
if it's not working out there, then and you're a good solid engineer or designer, then you'll go find somewhere else to go.
So yeah, basically what happened was Facebook. They were in the point where, all right, we just went IPO, our stock price crashed. All of our investors don't really need the company to do well anymore, so we're kind of on our own. We need to get the revenue up and the stock price up so that we can hire people and keep this company going. So, and this all happened when right after Arab Spring, when people were recognizing like, hey, I can use this platform to do a variety of different things, including recruiting and radicalizing people into an extremist ideology. Facebook was in the point where like, all right, we need to do whatever we can in order to start making some money. So that set them up in a point where they were going to be leaning heavily into advertising. They ramped up their targeted advertising using user data to make that advertising as effective as possible. They allowed things to happen on their platform that a financially successful company might not do. For example, you would never, ever go to Disneyland and see people doing the kinds of things they do on social media platforms ever. Disney would not allow that. And then, long story short, I mean, Twitter was also in this kind of situation. Snapchat kind of ended up in this situation for a while, also, where the after their IPO, their stock price dropped. They weren't making a great deal of profit. Their revenue might have been okay, but they had to do something in order to figure it out and get their stock price up.
Yeah.
And for Facebook, it worked. They increased their stock price. They purchased Instagram, which accounts now for the majority of their revenue. And they have, as a result, been extremely reluctant to do anything that would reduce their revenue, such as cutting down on outrage on their platform or limiting the effectiveness of target marketing.
So, I mean, this is a great outline of kind of where it all went wrong. So, like, I guess my big question is so what's the solution, right? I know that some things have been proposed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I look at a lot of these platforms. Twitter is a prime example. I think a lot of them are dying a slow death, and Twitter is extremely reluctant to innovate. And when they do, it's usually something where they're ripping off somebody else's ideas, like Fleet. So weirdly, we don't know. Even though they're just in San Francisco, they're right next to us. I don't know too many people. I know a few, but I don't know too many people at Twitter. I don't really know that much about what's going on inside there.
Hmm.
But it feels like there is just this urge to replace these Twitters and Facebooks with platforms like TikTok, where it's maybe not so much about just one thing, or not so much about everything, but it's more focused on one thing. Like on TikTok, it's much more like, hey, you know what? Keep largely, there's some counter examples, but largely, keep your flame wars and your political arguments off the platform. We're gonna dance. We're gonna look at cute animals. We're gonna have some fun here.
Well, I mean, that's essentially if you just if you just stood back and looked at all the platforms, who's doing the best, right? Instagram with pictures and TikTok with all their kind of funny, kind of uplifting videos that are out there that people like. I mean, like I've heard a couple people come up with some ideas. So one of them is just kill comments completely. So start off with that. So you can post things. You can do like a little emoji of like thumbs up, thumbs down, happy face, frown face, or whatever it is. But just not going to let people comment anymore. Like you're there to observe and see what other people are thinking. Okay, that's like stage one. And stage two is just rapidly expanding the number of people at the companies that are going through and just deleting anything that's posted that breaks their terms of service. That one's a tough one too, because then you have to really train them on specifically what needs to be removed, what needs to stay up, what actually was a joke versus not a joke. I mean, I could see where it gets complicated, but at least the broad strokes of like people posting like inflammatory comments about different cultures and things like that, done. That's it. And you know what? The first time they post it, they're banned forever. Just be like super harsh about it, right? Like that's one idea that came across. The other one that came across, which I thought was really interesting, is having this tiered paywall system so that if you want to be able to post on a regular basis on the platform, like let's say more than X number of times per day or whatever it is, you pay. It costs you to be on there. So like CNN would pay to be on there. These bigger networks would pay to be on there. And people like you and I, we could be on there and we can engage, but we just can't engage as much as they do. And that allows you to kind of cut out, whatever, 20% of the people who are just going on there and just going crazy or making all these fake accounts, right?
Yeah, I think there has to be the will to do any of these things. I mean, the technology for the most part exists. We know statistically that when Trump and some of the worst offenders got removed from Twitter, the amount of misinformation on the platform dropped by 70%.
Yeah, huge,
So, yeah.
right? And maybe it wasn't, just him. Maybe like he dropped off, so then all the people that were just like him said, "Well, he's no longer on there, so I'm not interested in doing this either," right?
They banned a set of kind of the worst QAnon offenders on Twitter, and it wasn't a huge number in the grand scheme of things, but they were the most impactful accounts, so they ended up having the broadest impact on the user base. But at a fundamental level, content moderation has become a debate, and it shouldn't be. Content moderation is absolutely essential for the long-term success of any of these companies. If Twitter had their content moderation process really worked out the way that it should have been, they probably would have been acquired by Disney. You remember not too long ago, Disney was thinking about acquiring Twitter.
Yeah.
And they literally said that they weren't going to acquire it because it's way too toxic. And Disney is not associated with toxicity. They do not want to be associated with it. They're not saying you can't have your disagreements and your arguments and your opinion. They're just like, we are not going to have a part of that. That's just not a part of who we are. We want our experience to be fun and happy and joyful. And that's not what Twitter is.
I think they still have the opportunity to do that. I mean, Jack Dorsey can wake up tomorrow morning and say, okay, that's it. I've decided we're just going to start banning like all these different people on the platform. We're going to clean it up. We're going to put a paywall up. We're going to have hire, 10,000 moderators. We're going to completely shift this company. They could do that. I just don't know what the financial outcome is going to be for them, right? I think that's the big question mark. People just don't know what that actually means.
Well, I think fundamentally the problem with social is a problem of the product. It's not as much the profit model. So I think subscription could be helpful because you're automatically removing some people who are just being trolls and they're doing this for laughs and things like that. But I think at the end of the day, having some level of content moderation is pretty essential. And they have the technology, they have the methodology to do it. There's first, we need to get over this idea that there's some kind of a First Amendment right in order for not just for you to have your opinion, which is what
Yeah.
the First Amendment is really about, is for you to have your opinion and not to be thrown in jail like Lenny Bruce was, right? Like people
Yeah.
forget about this when they talk about cancel culture. So you go back to the 50s and 60s and people who were being canceled, quote unquote canceled, they got put in jail and or they got blackballed, right? You look back at that recent movie Mank about screenwriter Mankiewicz and some other people
Uh-huh.
who got blackballed because they thought communism was a good idea. Now, turns out communism probably isn't a good idea based on how everything worked out. But should these people have been silenced and blackballed and some of them put in prison for their ideas and having their opinions? No, that's what the First Amendment is supposed to protect against. This is, I think, a completely separate issue. It's not these companies, it's not Twitter saying you can't have an opinion. It's them saying like, hey, there are certain things that are allowed on our platform. You know, every platform, every piece of technology, that's somebody's baby, right? That is these companies' property. And it doesn't get applied, interestingly, outside of social platforms, right? You don't hear people saying, Marjorie Taylor Greene saying like, hey, Fox News won't give me all of the airtime that I want. They're stifling me and they're silencing me. That's
Yeah.
it doesn't get applied to those companies in that way. And in the same way, it's not like, hey, I want to go down to, my local Safeway and post all the political stuff that I want. And Safeway has to let me do that because it's my First Amendment right. It doesn't get applied to those companies. So it shouldn't be applied to social media companies either.
What do you think about this idea of basically requiring verification of who you are? So, like, if you go on Airbnb, for example, and you want to go rent
Mm-hmm.
someone's place, it requires verification. And one of those ways they do it is they make you send in a picture of your driver's license to
Well, if you're doing
verify
something
you are who you are.
if you're matching human beings up person to person, I think it's important. I think you want to try to for Uber, for Airbnb, maybe even for dating apps like Bumble. I think you need to verify that person is who they are, that they're not, some psycho killer or have a history of sexual assault or any of those things. You want to try to filter that out. For social, I think it would absolutely help. I had the kind of mental experiment a while ago, and you and I were talking about it, where if somebody violates the terms of service through harassment or through racism, whatever else, they just lose their anonymity. It's like, oh, hey, this hate monger 308 is actually this dude. The reality is that wouldn't be legal under I think especially European law.
Mm-hmm.
But this protection of anonymity is one of the things that is allowing this to happen.
If you think about it, Nextdoor does have stuff that happens on there, but
Mm-hmm.
for some reason it kind of stops at a certain point. And I think the reason is number one, they know who you are,
Yeah.
right? And number two is they know your address.
Well,
Right.
didn't we have
Nextdoor
to?
has address
Yeah.
verification and all this stuff. So, like, even though people would say stuff like, I don't want these people walking down my street, or like they say things like that, it kind of, in my opinion, just on what I'm seeing, it doesn't elevate really heavily above that
Yeah.
because they know exactly who you are, just like you said earlier on in this podcast. Right. So, there could be some psychology there where by making people verify, through two or three sources, like, okay, here's my name, here's my email, and here's my document that indicates I am who I am. If I want to be on the platform, this is what I have to show, might really make a big impact.
Well, I think they have to do that on Nextdoor because there's a possibility that, like, oh, I know anytime where you might know who that person is and they're in your community, and but you don't know who the other person is, that frees up that other person to do things that could be
Yeah.
very bad.
So,
Because
what
then,
would you say, though, like, I don't know, the transition to the next generation? So, if we're talking about the
well,
future,
yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is like just make social about one thing. Like instead of it just being like, hey, here Facebook is a place you do to do everything, place you go to do everything that's social. Just make it more like TikTok, where it's like, okay, this is where I go to see cute animals and people dancing. Or I would love, love, love if there was a version of Twitter that was just news. kind
I
of
would
all
sign
the
up for that.
opinion,
Yeah.
argumentation. I'd pay like a couple bucks a month even for that. Just news, just facts, or a platform that's just about entertainment news. Like Fandom kind of does this a little bit. It's a little bit less social. There's a social
Yeah.
element to it, but it's like you don't go to Fandom or IMDb to talk about immigration issues. It's just not what it's for,
No,
right?
no,
It's
but
for like
to your
good fun
point
stuff.
though, like I was thinking about how Reddit works, right? Is that you can just
Yeah,
follow a subreddit, right? And like Wall Street Bets or something like that, right? And then that's all you are reading. So like I imagine if they had something called like Twitter News and I could just pay a couple bucks, I won't connect with anyone else except for like all the news networks that I'm interested in or news providers. And then every time I log in, I can just scroll and check out the news and it's like real time almost. And I just know that I'm never going to run into a garbage, that is going to kind of fire me up or
yeah,
whatever it is. That would be pretty cool. Like, I think that's a big opportunity for them, although it doesn't seem like a big opportunity because you're narrowing it only to news, but it could be a way to reform how the company
yeah.
functions. Like I can imagine you log into Twitter, you verify who you are, all this kind of stuff. Then they say, "Oh, do you want to be part of the news network? Do you want to be part of the media network? Like, do you want to have a couple different ones?" It's almost like television channels, right?
Yeah, it is. It's kind of like if you take Twitter and you're like, all right, well, just create kind of like Reddit has, create different subcategories. So it's not all just through one omnibus website, but like, hey, it's got a like you go to Google News if you're going to news, and it's still a search engine and an aggregator. It's just you're going through a news channel. So
Yeah.
I think that would be great. And for Twitter, if they had like, here's where people can argue space. I don't know necessarily how they would direct people to it, but like give them a space for their opinions and for them to argue and let those people
Hmm.
go at it and leave the rest of us alone.
Yeah,
But
because
you
you
brought up,
follow a lot of sports, right? Like football and stuff. Like, would you be
yeah,
interested in like a social football site where it's like Twitter Sports or something where you're only getting that and nothing else with no comments?
I think that would be great. One of the issues with sports is that there are people within the sports field who have taken up the model of being that shock jock, and they'll say things like, "Oh, Tom Brady was a system quarterback" and things like that. It's just ridiculous, but they're saying it because they know a lot of people, like they're going to get like 1,000 people saying that, no, he's not. That's ridiculous. How could you say that? Well, they can say that because
Mm,
they know that they're going to get 1,000 people responding to them, and that
yeah.
Twitter's gonna elevate their statement because they did. So I think Reddit is actually informative about this because Reddit has very simple content moderation, and they've had problems before, and like they've had subreddits that have had to be banned, and they were a little bit slow to do that. But if you look at an individual subreddit that's based around an interest, like I'm on the audiophile subreddit, or I'm on the bonsai subreddit because I recently bought a bonsai. I want to know how to take care of it.
Yeah.
You don't see a lot of flame wars in there. I mean, every now and then you see people arguing, but it's not too bad. And one of the things that Reddit does is they can set up bots that can recognize, they have enough semantic processing to recognize when somebody's being outright insulting, and they remove those automatically. And then they have a mod
Hmm.
they can go through and restore them if they want to. And also, if things get downvoted, instead of on Facebook, those things that are inflammatory would get shot up to the top, and Facebook would say this is the most important comment on this or reply to this post.
Yeah.
For Reddit, it gets hidden. If something gets downgraded, it becomes like, all right, well, here's the normal comments that everybody said, and then the other stuff is hidden. And if you want to see them, you've got to click on show more.
Do you think this is just a natural progression, though, of the technology? Meaning, like, the first decade of this technology, let me see. Yeah, first decade of this technology, we kind of went all out and here's what happened. And then the next decade of this technology, it'll get, tightened up and
Yeah,
fixed and be a better place.
yeah. I think we're going to get to the point of outrage fatigue where everybody's just kind of
Yeah.
tired of it and they don't want to look at it and they're just bored of it. And I think one of the realities of media in general, and this is one of the reasons why I think most of the social media we have now, so eventually any form of media ends up getting replaced.
Yeah.
And not even just the form, but just the iteration, right? So you don't, Godfather might be the best movie ever made, but you don't just watch The Godfather over and over and over again, right?
True.
You watch it, and then you go watch other movies. And it's the same thing
Yeah.
with Facebook. It's the same thing with like clubs, right? What's the old adage about clubs? It comes out, the big club is the one that just got launched recently, using Silicon Valley terms. It just opened recently. They had their grand opening. Everybody's going to go to that club for 3 to 6 months, and then they're going to go to the next hot club that come out, and then that club's going to shut down, and they're going to rebrand, and they're going to reopen, and they'll be hot for like 3 to 6 months, right?
Yeah. How many times did we see that in San Jose when we were in college, right?
Oh yeah, all the time, right? And it happens everywhere. So I think that's what social media is, just like, you don't see a whole lot of younger people on Facebook anymore. And
Yeah.
to some extent also, like, I also feel like there's a demographic change where when older people got onto Facebook, they didn't necessarily implement the same kind of social interaction rules that younger people were doing. They were just
Sure.
like, I'm older, I don't care anymore, I know better than you, and I'm just going to speak my mind rather than honestly having a little bit of politeness to them.
Well, I think that's a great place to probably stop. I think you and I could probably go on for 4 hours talking about this topic, but I thought this was really good. I'm glad that you had the opportunity to dig in and basically look at the history of this stuff and really kind of step back from it, because I know that we're integrated into it. Not that we work with social companies that much, but like we're integrated in it, living here in Silicon Valley, and we think about it a lot, and we really want to solve this problem. I don't think social needs to die and disappear. Like I don't. I just think it needs to be moderated in a way that allows people to not feel, threatened and treated poorly, but actually can have an enjoyable experience on it. On the line of Twitter and social, I just want to tell everybody that the X Podcast One, number one, is our handle on Twitter. So if you'd like to come and write us, we can talk about anything. So if you have any interests, please let us know on our Twitter at the X Podcast One. And with that said, I will say goodbye, and we will see everyone next week. Great job, Dee. That was a lot of fun.
Awesome.